Meantime, he propped their lovely corpses at the table and went about the room lighting all the candles until it blazed as if for a wedding. "Come in, Louis," he said. "I would have arranged an escort for you, but I know what a man you are about choosing your own." "Pity Mademoiselle Freniere likes to hurl flaming lanterns. It makes a party unwieldy, don't you think? Especially for a hotel." He seated the blonde-haired girl so that her head lay to one side against the damask back of the chair, and the darker woman lay with her chin resting just above her breasts. This one had blanched, and her features had a rigid look to them already, as though she was one of those women in whom the fire of personality makes beauty. But the other looked only as if she slept, and I was not sure that she was even dead. Lestat had made 2 gashes, one in her throat and one above her left breast, and both still bled freely. He lifted her wrist now, and slitting it with a knife filled 2 wine-glasses and bade me to sit down. "I am leaving you," I said to him at once. "I wish to tell you that now." "I thought as much," he answered, sitting back in the chair. "And I thought as well that you would make a flowery announcement. Tell me what a monster I am, what a vulgar fiend." "I make no judgments upon you. I'm not interested in you. I am interested in my own nature now, and I've come to believe I can't trust you to tell me the truth about it. You use knowledge for personal power," I told him. And I suppose, in the matter of many people making such an announcement, I was not looking for him to give an honest response. I was not looking at him at all. I was mainly listening to my own words. But now I saw that his face was once again the way it had been when he said we would talk. He was listening to me. I was suddenly at a loss. I felt that gulf between us as painfully as ever. "Why did you ever become a vampire?" I blurted out. "And why such a vampire as you are? Vengeful and delighting in taking human life even when you have no need. This girl, why did you kill her when one would have done? And why did you frighten her so before you killed her? And why have you propped her here in some grotesque manner, as if tempting the gods to strike you down for blasphemy?" All this he listened to without speaking, and in the pause that followed I again felt at a loss. Lestat's eyes were large and thoughtful. I'd seen them that way before, but I couldn't remember when, certainly not when talking to me. "What do you think a vampire is?" he asked me sincerely. "I don't pretend to know. You pretend to know. What is it?" I asked, and to this he answered nothing. It was as if he sensed the insincerity of it, the spite. He just sat there looking at me with the same still expression. Then I said, "I know that after leaving you I shall try to find out. I'll travel the world if I have to find other vampires. I know they must exist. I don't know of any reasons why they shouldn't exist in great numbers, and I'm confident I shall find vampires who have more in common with me than I with you. Vampires who understand knowledge as I do, and have used their superior vampire nature to learn secrets of which you don't even dream. If you haven't told me everything, I shall find things out for myself or from them when I find them." He shook his head. "Louis," he said, "you are in love with your mortal nature. You chase after the phantoms of your former self. Freniere, his sister, these are images for you of what you were and what you still long to be. And in your romance with mortal life, you're dead to your vampire nature." I objected to this at once. My vampire nature has been for me the greatest adventure of my life. All that went before it was confused, clouded. I went through mortal life like a blind man groping from solid object to solid object. It was only when I became a vampire that I respected for the first time all of life. I never saw a living, pulsing human being until I was a vampire. I never knew what life was until it ran out in a red gush over my lips, my hands. I found myself staring at the 2 women, the darker one now turning a terrible shade of blue. The blonde was breathing. "She's not dead," I said to him suddenly. "I know. Let her alone," he said. He lifted her wrist and made a new gash by the scab of the other and filled his glass. "All that you say makes sense," he said to me, taking a drink. "You are an intellect. I've never been. What I've learned from listening to men talk, not from books. I never went to school long enough, but I'm not stupid. And you must listen to me, because you are in danger. You do not know your vampire nature. You are like an adult who, looking back on his childhood, realizes that he never appreciated. You cannot, as a man, go back to the nursery and play with your toys, asking for the love and care to be showered on you again, simply because now you know their worth. So it is with you and your mortal nature. You've given it up. You no longer look through a glass darkly, but you cannot pass back to the world of human warmth with your new eyes." "I know that well enough," I said. "But what is it that is our nature? If I can live from the blood of animals, why should I not live from the blood of animals, rather than go through the world bringing misery and death to human creatures?" "Does it bring you happiness?" he asked. "You wander through the night, feeding on rats like a pauper, and then moon at Babette's window, filled with care, yet helpless as the goddess who came by night to watch Endymion sleep, and could not have him. And suppose you could hear her in your arms, and she would look on you without horror or disgust. What then? A few short years to watch her suffer every prick of mortality, and then die before your eyes. Does this give happiness? This is insanity, Louis. This is vain. And what truly lies before you is vampire nature, which is killing. For I guarantee you that if you walk the streets tonight and strike down a woman as rich and beautiful as Babette, and suck her blood until she drops at your feet, you will have no hunger left for Babette's profile in the candlelight, or for listening by the window for the sound of her voice. You will be filled, Louis, as you were meant to be, with all the life that you can hold, and you will have hunger when that's gone for the same, and the same, the red, and you will have hunger when that's gone for the same, and the same, and the same. The red in this glass will be just as red, the roses on the wallpaper just as delicately drawn, and you'll see the moon the same way, and the same flicker of a candle, and with the same sensibility that you cherish, you will see the death in all its beauty. Life as it is only known on the very point of death. Don't you understand that, Louis? You alone of all creatures can see death that way, with impunity. You alone, under the rising moon, can strike like the hand of God." He sat back now and drained the glass, and his eyes moved over the unconscious woman. Her breasts heaved and her eyebrows knit as she were coming around. A moan escaped her lips. He'd never spoken such words to me before, as I had not thought him capable of it. "Vampires are killers," he said now. "Predators, whose all-seeing eyes were meant to give them detachment, the ability to see a human life in its entirety, not with any mawkish sorrow, but with a thrilling satisfaction in being the end of that life, in having a hand in the divine plan." "That is how you see it," I protested. The girl moaned again. Her face was very white. Her head rolled against the back of the chair. "That is the way it is," he answered. "You talk of finding other vampires. Vampires are killers. They don't want you or your sensibility. They'll see you coming long before you see them, and they'll see your flaw, and, distrusting you, they'll seek to kill you. They'd seek to kill you even if you were like me, because they are lone predators and seek for companionship no more than cats in the jungle. They're jealous of their secret and of their territory, and if you find one or more of them together, it will be for safety only. and one will be the slave of the other, the way you are of me. I'm not your slave, I said to him, but even as he spoke I realized I'd been his slave all along. That's how vampires increase. Through slavery. How else? He asked. He looked at the girl's wrist again, and she cried out as the knife cut. She opened her eyes slowly as he held her wrist over the glass. She blinked and strained to keep them open, as if a veil was covering her eyes. You're tired, aren't you? He asked her. She gazed at him as if she couldn't really see him. Tired, he said, now leaning close and staring into her eyes. You want to sleep? Yes, she moaned softly, and he picked her up and took her into the bedroom. Our coffins rested on the carpet, and against the wall there was a velvet draped bed. Lestat did not put her on the bed. He lowered her slowly into his coffin. What are you doing? I asked him, coming to the door sill. The girl was looking around like a terrified child. No, she was moaning, and then, as he closed the lid, she screamed. She continued to scream within the coffin. Why do you do this, Lestat? I asked. I like to do it, he said. I enjoy it. He looked at me. I don't say that you have to enjoy it. Take your aesthetics. I don't say that you have to enjoy it. Take your aesthete's taste to purer things. Kill them swiftly if you will, but do it. Learn that you're a killer. Ah. He threw up his hands in disgust. The girl had stopped screaming. Now he drew up a little curved-legged chair beside the coffin, and, crossing his legs, he looked at the coffin lid. His was a black varnished coffin, not a pure rectangular box as they are now, but tapered at both ends, widest where the corpse might lay his hands upon his chest. It suggested the human form. It opened, and the girl sat up astonished, wild-eyed, her lips blue and trembling. Lie down, love, he said to her, and pushed her back, and she lay, near hysterical, staring up at him. You're dead, love, he said to her, and she screamed and turned desperately in the coffin like a fish, as if her body could escape through the sides, through the bottom. It's a coffin, she cried. Let me out. But we all must lie in coffins eventually, he said to her. Lie still, love. This is your coffin. Most of us never get to know what it feels like. You know what it feels like, he said to her. I couldn't tell whether she was listening or not, or just going wild, but she saw me in the doorway, and then she lay still, looking at Lestat and then at me. Help me, she said to me. Lestat looked at me. I expected you to feel these things instinctually, as I did, he said. When I gave you that first kill, I thought you would hunger for the next and the next, that you would go to each human life as if to a full cup, the way I had. But you didn't. And all this time I suppose I kept from straightening you out, because you were at best weaker. And all this time I suppose I kept from straightening you out, because you were best weaker. I'd watch you playing Shadow in the night, staring at the falling rain, and I'd think, he's easy to manage, he's simple, but you're weak, Louis. You're a mark. For vampires and now for humans alike. This thing with Babette has exposed us both. It's as if you want us both to be destroyed. I can't stand to watch what you're doing, I said, turning my back. The girl's eyes were burning into my flesh. She lay, all the time he spoke, staring at me. You can stand it, he said. I saw you last night with that child. You're a vampire, the same as I am. He stood up and came towards me, but the girl rose again and he turned to shove her down. Do you think we should make her a vampire? Share our lives with her? He asked. Instantly I said, no. Why? Because she's nothing but a whore? He asked. A damned expensive whore at that, he said. Can she live now, or has she lost too much? I asked him. Touching, he said. She can't live. Then kill her. She began to scream. He just sat there. I turned around. He was smiling. and the girl had turned her face to the satin and was sobbing. Her reason had almost entirely left her. She was crying and praying. She was praying to the Virgin to save her. Her hands over her face now over her head, the wrist smearing blood in her hair and on the satin. I bent over the coffin. She was dying, it was true. Her eyes were burning, but the tissue around them was already bluish, and now she smiled. "You won't let me die, will you?" she whispered. "You'll save me." Lestat reached over and took her wrist. "But it's too late, love," he said. "Look at your wrist, your breast." And then he touched the wound in her throat. She put her hands to her throat and gasped, her mouth open. She put her hands to her throat and gasped, her mouth open. The scream strangled. I stared at Lestat. I could not understand why he did this. His face was as smooth as mine is now, more animated for the blood, but cold and without emotion. He did not leer like a stage villain, nor hunger for her suffering as if the cruelty fed him. He simply watched her. I never meant to be bad," she was crying. "I only did what I had to do. You won't let this happen to me. You'll let me go. I can't die like this. I can't." She was sobbing, the sobs dry and thin. "You'll let me go. I have to go to the priest. You'll let me go." "But my friend is a priest," said Lestat, smiling, as if he'd just thought of it as a joke. "This is your funeral, dear. You see, you were at a dinner party and you died, but God has given you another chance to be absolved. Don't you see? Tell him your sins." She shook her head at first, and then she looked at me again with those pleading eyes. "Is it true?" she whispered. "Well," said Lestat, "I suppose you're not contrite, dear. I shall have to shut the lid." "Stop this, Lestat!" I shouted at him. The girl was screaming again, and I could not stand the sight of it any longer. I bent down to her and took her hand. I can't remember my sins," she said, just as I was looking at her wrist, resolved to kill her. "You mustn't try. Tell God only that you are sorry," I said, "and then you'll die and it will be over." She lay back and her eyes shut. I sank my teeth into her wrist and began to suck her dry. She stirred once as if dreaming and said a name, and then, when I felt her heartbeat reach that hypnotic slowness, I drew back from her, dizzy, confused for the moment, my hands reaching for the door frame. I saw her as if in a dream. The candles glared in the corner of my eye. I saw her lying utterly still, and Lestat sat composed beside her, like a mourner. His face was still. "Louis," he said to me, "don't you understand? Peace will only come to you when you can do this every night of your life. There is nothing else, but this is everything." His voice was almost tender as he spoke, and he rose to put both his hands on my shoulders. I walked into the parlor, shying away from his touch, but not resolute enough to push him off. "Come with me, out into the streets. It's late. You haven't drunk enough. Let me show you what you are. Really. Forgive me if I bungled it, left too much to nature. Come." "I can't bear it, Lestat," I said to him. "You chose your companion badly." "But Louis," he said, "you haven't tried." The vampire stopped. He was studying the boy, and the boy, astonished, said nothing. It was true what he'd said. I had not drunk enough, and shaken by the girl's fear, I let him lead me out to the hotel, down the back stairs. People were coming now from the Condé Street ballroom, and the narrow street was jammed. There were supper parties in the hotels, and the planter families were lodged in town in great numbers, and we passed through them like a nightmare. My agony was unbearable. Never since I was a human being had I felt such mental pain. It was because of all of Lestat's words that had made sense to me. I knew peace only when I killed, only for that minute, and there was no question in my mind that the killing of anything less than a human being brought nothing but a vague longing, the discontent which had brought me close to humans, to watch their lives through glass. I was no vampire, and in my pain I asked irrationally like a child, could I not return? Could I not be human again? Even as the blood of that girl was warm in me, and I felt that physical thrill and strength, I asked that question. The faces of humans passed me like candle flames in the night dancing on dark waves. I was sinking into the darkness. I was weary of longing. I was turning around and around in the street, looking at the stars and thinking, yes, it's true. I know what he is saying is true. That when I kill there is no longing, and I can't bear this truth. I can't bear it. Suddenly there was one of those arresting moments. The street was utterly quiet. We had strayed far from the main part of the old town, and were near the ramparts. There were no lights, only the fire in a window and the far-off sound of people laughing, but no one here. No one near us. I could feel the breeze suddenly from the river and the hot air of the night rising, and Lestat near me, so still he might have been made of stone. Over the long, low road of pointed roofs were the massive shapes of oak trees and the dark, great swaying forms of myriad sounds under the low-hung stars. The pain for the moment was gone. The confusion was gone. I closed my eyes and heard the wind and the sound of water flowing softly, swiftly in the river. It was enough for one moment, and I knew that it would not endure, that it would fly away from me like something torn out of my arms, and I would fly after it, more desperately lonely than any creature under God, to get it back. And then a voice beside me rumbled deep in the sound of the night, a drumbeat as the moment ended, saying, "Do what it is your nature to do. This is but a taste of it. Do what it is your nature to do." And the moment was gone. I stood like the girl in the parlor in the hotel, dazed and ready for the slightest suggestion. I was nodding at Lestat as he nodded at me. "Pain is terrible for you," he said. "You feel it like no other creature because you are a vampire. You don't want it to go on." "No," I answered him. "I'll feel as I felt with her, wed to her and weightless, caught as if by a dance. That and more." His hand tightened on me. "Don't turn away from it. Don't turn away from it. Come with me." He led me quickly through the street, turning every time I hesitated, his hand out for mine, a smile on his lips, his presence as marvelous to me as the night he'd come in my mortal life and told me we would be vampires. "Evil is a point of view," he whispered now. "We are immortal, and what we have before us are the rich feasts that conscience cannot appreciate, and mortal men cannot know without regret. God kills, and so shall we, indiscriminately. He takes the richest and the poorest, and so shall we, for no creature under God as so we are, none so like him as ourselves, dark angels not confined to the stinking limits of hell, but wandering his earth and all its kingdoms. I want a child tonight. I am like a mother. I want a child." I should have known what he meant. I did not. He had me mesmerized, enchanted. He was playing me as he had when I was mortal. He was leading me. He was saying, "Your pain will end." We'd come on a street of lighted windows. It was a place of rooming houses, sailors, flatboat men. We entered a narrow door, and then, in a hollow stone passage in which I could hear my own breath like the wind, he crept along the wall until his shadow leapt out in the light of a doorway, beside the shadow of another man, their heads bent together, their whispers like the rustling of dry leaves. "What is it?" I drew near him as he came back, afraid suddenly this exhilaration in me would die. I saw again that nightmare landscape I'd seen when I spoke with Babette. I felt the chill of loneliness, the chill of guilt. "She's there," he said. "Your wounded one. Your daughter." "What do you say? What are you talking about?" "You've saved her," he whispered. "I knew it. You left the window wide on her and her dead mother, and people passing in the street brought her here." "The child, the little girl," I gasped, but he was already leading me through the door to stand at the end of the long ward of wooden beds, each with a child beneath a narrow white blanket. One candle at the end of the ward, where a nurse bent over a small desk. We walked down the aisle between the rows. "Starving children. Orphans," he said. "Children of plague and fever." He stopped. I saw the little girl lying in the bed, and then the man was coming, and he was whispering with Lestat. Such care for the sleeping little ones. Someone in another room was crying. The nurse rose and hurried away. And now the doctor bent and wrapped the child in the blanket. Lestat had taken money from his pocket and set it on the foot of the bed. The doctor was saying how glad he was we'd come for her, how most of them were orphans. They came in on the ships, sometimes orphans too young even to tell which body was that of their mother. He thought Lestat was the father. And in moments, Lestat was running through the streets with her, the white of the blanket gleaming against his dark coat and cape, and even to my expert vision, as I ran after him, it seemed sometimes as if the blanket flew through the night with no one holding it. A shifting shape, travelling on the wind like a leaf, stood upright and sent scurrying along a passage, trying to gain the wind all the while and truly take flight. I caught him finally as we approached the lamp near the the Place d'Armes. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that. The child lay pale on his shoulder, her cheeks still full like plums, though she was drained and near death. She opened her eyes, or rather the lids slid back, and beneath the long curling lashes I saw a streak of white. "Lestat, what are you doing? Where are you taking her?" I demanded, but I knew too well. He was heading for the hotel and meant to take her into our room. And that's where we'll leave it for today. Alright, so in today's section, we saw one of the, in my opinion, best exchanges between Louis and Lestat in the novel. Following one of the most, I would say, horrific scenes with Lestat's murder of the two women, we then get this discussion between him and Louis where he justifies his actions in this kind of grander philosophical context. And I guess the main thing to address in that regard is this notion Lestat brings up regarding vampire nature and his and Louis' vampire nature and what it means in the grander scheme of things to be a vampire and how you should behave in that manner. And the conclusion Lestat generally comes to throughout the text, and the conclusion he explains here, is one in which he is representative of this kind of apex predator, Darwinian super creature. He very much argues for this kind of survival of the fittest, exploitation as natural view of the world, where those who are more powerful, i.e. vampires, should be on top of those who are weaker, i.e. humans. Which essentially turns Lestat's characterization into this kind of capitalistic social Darwinist. He readily ignores any of the advantages he experienced in his own life through things that are of no, are of no fault of his own, such as his aristocratic upbringing. And he then uses the advantages he's gotten in his vampirism, the power, to subjugate people. This subjugation is, metaphorical in the concept of, his slavery of Louis, but it's also quite literal and brutal in the, draining and feeding of mortals. And this Darwinistic view of the world comes out in his dialogue, where he gets this whole moral relativist slant where he's like, evil isn't real, nature is about killing, and all of that. And all this does is further serve to highlight his self-aggrandizing delusion that he is, he has constructed his worldview so that he is on top, and so that his power and his strength is only right to be used for the horrific acts that he commits. And that's interesting, because if we look at Lestat symbolically, he is basically the epitome of an aristocratic figure. He's white, he's male, and he is inexplicably wealthy, with that wealth coming from ill-gotten means, for the most part. In this case, literally just stolen off of corpses. And obviously vampires, quite traditionally, serve a capitalistic metaphor. Marx, most notably, I think, uses vampire analogues a lot when talking about the nature of capitalistic exploitation. And in Lestat, we essentially see this narrative told from the other way round, in which, with Lestat, we hear the voice of this aristocratic capitalist trying to justify to itself why its exploitation over the world is correct and right and the just way of things, because evil isn't actually real, and therefore I can do whatever I want. He has this innate need to possess and dominate. Let's go back to that observation, that comment from Marx, where he talks about capital acting as if possessed by love, or whatever the specific line is, or with the ardor of love, or whatever. It takes on this mind of its own. And in Lestat, this desire for capitalistic acquisition has taken on its mind of its own. He has this need to possess and dominate all that he comes across. And that takes the form of both wealth, as we've seen with Point du Lac, and as we've seen with the money he takes from the people he kills, and the lavish lifestyle he leads. And it also comes in the form of people, as we're seeing with Louis, and as we are about to see with Claudia. Another cool thing that we see in this section is Louis's religious imagery kind of getting turned on its head and used against him. And Lestat is very clever in the way he employs this, because Louis has been bemoaning his situation through religious terms the entire time, and then Lestat comes along and figures out a very clever way to turn this crisis of faith on its head and try to win Louis over, at least temporarily, before he can find a more permanent solution. And one of the ways he does this is he kind of forcibly makes Louis act out the role of priest as the woman dies in the coffin before him. And of course he is incapable of really effectively playing this role. He just kind of mumbles out some words and isn't able to offer her proper comfort in that time. And indeed, he drains her. He doesn't just let her die naturally. He kind of quote-unquote mercy kills her in that regard. But that mercy killing is also serving himself in bringing the blood in, getting him a taste for blood and convincing him to go out onto the streets with Lestat afterwards. But there's also this language from Lestat in which he takes Louis's angel analogue and devil analogue and flips that on its head as well, where he argues in terms of them being dark angels who are either who can be as God, who can act as God, which is of course reminiscent of Lucifer and the fall. But also, he makes this argument of them being kind of God's agents of evil in the world. The line is like, God kills indiscriminately, so why shouldn't we? Or something to that effect. And ultimately, I think one of the cool things we see in that line is obviously this religious imagery is very heavily laid on. But underneath that religious imagery is the crisis of faith and the secularism that they are facing. Their evil in this regard is kind of justified in anger at the non-existence of God as far as they can perceive. The indiscriminate killing of God is a parallel for the uncaring secular nature of the universe that they have been beholden to. And this returns again and gives a more complex layer to the notion of Lestat taking revenge on life itself. No longer is he just taking revenge for the bad things that have happened to him. We now get a better degree of depth to his character, I think, and he appears to be just very, very angsty and taking revenge against life in general. There's the C.S. Lewis quote, I believe it is, where it goes to the effect of, "I had decided God had not exist, and I had also decided I was very angry at God for not existing." It's kind of that notion of thinking, except taken to a much more murderous degree. A really cool thing in this section, the entire bed of satin stuff is masterfully done. Again, this text is so good when it's dealing with that like existentialism, the dwelling on death, and the imagery surrounding death, and the notion of, who you never will know what the inside of your coffin feels like, but you get to, because you're about to die. Great stuff, and it is a good callback, where he talks. He uses the sexual imagery of lying on his bed of satin, when in reality what he means, of course, is that she will lie in his coffin as she dies. That's just really good. It's one of, in my opinion, the best lines in the film, in the book, sorry, and in the film subsequently it becomes one of the best lines. So ultimately, I think, what do we feel about the vampires of this text as kind of what they epitomize? And personally, I reject the notion of the vampires in Interview with the Vampire as examples of social outcasts. I think the later books in the series do a better job of presenting that narrative, but the later books in the series are also very, very different. So we'll take Interview on its own. And in Interview, it feels like these vampires are less outcasts and more immoral, capitalistic predators that represent the very upper echelons of society. They've reasoned away any duty to morality, and in the process they kind of reaffirm its necessity. Because we see that when they've abandoned this notion of any responsibility for their actions or any moral framework to their lives, their self-serving actions only end up bringing about suffering, both to other people and to themselves, because ultimately Louis is very unhappy. Lestat claims to be unhappy, but he's really quite unhappy and angry all the time, and he's constantly searching for ways to fill the void that is his soul. And we'll see with Claudia, Claudia is a entire other can of worms. But yeah, one of the best lines in the book, I think, is in this section, and it summarizes the entire moral structure of Lestat's view of the world, this self-centered view of the world, where Louis asks him, "Why do you do these things, Lestat?" And he responds, "I like to do it. It's what I like to do. It makes me feel good." And it's a great line, but in the context of all of Lestat's other actions, it reveals his villainy, and the ultimate villainy of that kind of self-serving worldview, where you care nothing for anyone but yourself. At the end of the day, you are actually your brother's keeper, no matter how much Lestat may wish to tell you otherwise. Anyway, that is another section of Interview with the Vampire. Really good section, really good scene between Lestat and Louis there, and we have got an even crazier section coming up soon with the creation of Claudia. So look forward to that, and I will see you again very soon.